It was late September, and the air in the Yorkshire Dales was already turning cold. The kind of cold that sneaks up on you, slipping past layers and leaving you with a chill in your bones. I had been camping on my own for years. Something about being in the wilderness helped clear my mind. The forests here, with their dense trees and winding paths, always felt like a second home. It wasn't my first solo trip, but I never could have expected what happened this time. I arrived mid-afternoon on a Friday, my car packed with everything I'd need for a quiet weekend away. The campsite was a simple one, a clearing deep in the woods, far from the usual tourist spots. I'd found it on an old map and had been coming here for years. It was peaceful, isolated, and rarely visited by anyone else. That was the appeal. No phones, no people, just the forest and me. After parking at a small gravel pull-off, I slung my pack over my shoulders and started the 2-mile hike to the clearing. The leaves were a mix of greens, yellows, and oranges, crunching underfoot with every step. Birds chirped above, and a light wind rustled the branches. It was the kind of calm that always felt reassuring. When I reached the clearing, I set up my tent on the flattest patch of ground I could find, a spot I'd used before. It was surrounded by tall trees, their branches forming a natural canopy overhead. After getting my camp set up, a small fire pit, my sleeping bag, and a chair, I settled in with a book and let the afternoon drift by. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped with it. I built a fire and cooked a simple dinner. The crackle of the flames and the occasional snap of a twig in the forest were the only sounds. Once the stars began to appear, I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and let sleep take over. The first night passed without issue. I woke early, brewed some coffee on my portable stove, and spent the morning exploring the woods around the clearing. I stuck to familiar paths, making sure not to wander too far. By the time I returned to camp, it was well into the afternoon. The firewood I'd collected the day before had burned quickly, so I spent a while gathering more. As evening came, I felt a subtle shift in the air. The forest was quieter than usual. The birds had stopped their chirping, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I shook it off, thinking it was just the weight of being alone getting to me. It wasn't the first time I'd felt uneasy in the woods, and I figured it wouldn't be the last. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. The silence outside felt unnatural, and every small sound seemed amplified. A snapping twig in the distance, the rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just deer or foxes moving through the forest. Still, I kept my flashlight close and dozed off eventually. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. My heart was racing, though I didn't know why at first. It was pitch black outside, and my fire had long since burned out. Listening closely, I realized what had jolted me awake. A sound just outside my tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I froze, barely breathing. The sound moved closer, then stopped. My tent zipper was drawn shut, and the fabric offered no visibility. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated. Turning it on would let whoever or whatever was out there know exactly where I was. Minutes passed. The sound didn't return, and I started to think maybe I'd imagined it. Just an animal, I told myself, or the wind playing tricks. I forced myself to lie back down, but sleep didn't come. Every little noise made me jump. The morning came, and I tried to shake off the unease. I checked the perimeter of my camp, but didn't find anything unusual. No footprints, no signs of animals. Maybe I was just overthinking things. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. I decided to stay close to camp that day, not wanting to stray too far from the safety of my supplies. By mid-afternoon, the woods felt eerily empty. I hadn't seen or heard a single animal all day, not even birds. The usual rustling of leaves was replaced with a suffocating silence. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, watching me. I built a larger fire that evening, hoping it would keep whatever I thought I'd heard at bay. As the flames flickered, I tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't paranoia, I was sure of it now. Something or someone was out there. The third night was when everything fell apart. I had just crawled into my tent when I heard it again. Footsteps, but closer this time. Slow, deliberate, circling the clearing. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight and knife. This wasn't an animal. It was too methodical, too human. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the faint shadow of feet through the thin fabric. Whoever it was didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Then, in one swift motion, the entire tent shook violently. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and burst out of the tent, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees. No one was there, but as I turned around, I saw it. My supplies had been ransacked. My food was gone, my pack torn open. Whoever was here had taken everything they could carry and vanished into the trees. Panic set in. I didn't feel safe staying another night, but hiking back to my car in the dark wasn't an option. I decided to keep the fire burning and stay awake until dawn. Every shadow, every sound felt like a threat. When the sun finally rose, I wasted no time packing up what little I had left. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. The hike back to the car felt endless, and every step was filled with the fear that I was being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the woods remained still. When I reached the gravel pull-off, my heart sank. My car's tires had been slashed, and the windshield was shattered. Someone had been here, and they wanted me stranded. My phone had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. I grabbed a tire iron from the trunk and started walking down the dirt road, every nerve on edge. After an hour, I heard the sound of an engine behind me. Relief washed over me as I turned to wave down the approaching vehicle, a rusted pickup truck. But as it slowed, the driver's face became clear. It was a man, rough-looking, with an unsettling grin. I stepped back as the truck rolled to a stop. He didn't say a word, just stared at me for a long moment before driving off. That's when I noticed it, my ransacked pack sitting in the bed of his truck. I didn't stop walking until I reached the next town, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. I told the police what happened, but they didn't find the man or my belongings. To this day, I don't know what he wanted or why he chose to target me. But every time I think about that trip, I can't help but wonder how close I came to something far worse. It was the summer of 2012, and I had just turned 28. My plan was to backpack through Europe, exploring the beautiful countryside and camping wherever I found a good spot. I was traveling alone, and it felt freeing. No schedules, no rules, just me, my gear, and the open road. By the time I reached northern Italy, I was a few weeks into my trip. I had already seen Florence and Venice, but I wanted something quieter now. I'd heard about the Dolomites, a stunning mountain range with plenty of camping spots, so I made my way there. The small villages nestled in the valleys gave me the perfect mix of culture and isolation. I arrived in a tiny village called San Pietro, a place so small it wasn't even on my map. It was surrounded by dense forests and rocky peaks, the kind of place where you feel like time slows down. The locals didn't seem to get many tourists, so they watched me curiously as I passed through with my large backpack. I bought some bread, cheese, and water from a local store, then headed into the forest to find a campsite. The woods were thick and dark, with towering trees that blocked out much of the late afternoon sun. I followed a small dirt trail for a while before veering off into the underbrush. After about an hour, I found a flat clearing surrounded by trees. It felt secluded but not too far from the trail. I set up my tent, unpacked my sleeping bag, and gathered some wood for a small fire. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, the air had turned cool. I lit the fire and ate my simple meal while enjoying the stillness. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful. I felt safe. As the fire burned low, I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and settled into my sleeping bag. The forest noises became a soothing background as I drifted off to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire outside had completely died down. The forest was eerily silent now, the kind of silence that makes you uneasy. Something had pulled me out of my sleep, but I couldn't figure out what. I lay still, listening, my senses on high alert. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like someone stepping on dry leaves. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but the sound didn't move like an animal. It was deliberate, slow, as if someone was trying to move quietly. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire pit was barely visible in the moonlight, and the forest beyond was a wall of black. I shone the light around the clearing but saw nothing. Still, the uneasy feeling in my gut didn't go away. I sat there for a while, listening. The rustling stopped, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back inside the tent. It took me a long time to fall asleep again. The next morning, I woke up to the sun filtering through the trees. The uneasy feeling from the night before had faded, replaced by the usual excitement of a day of exploring. I packed up my gear and decided to hike further into the forest before setting up camp again that evening. As I was packing, I noticed something strange near the edge of the clearing. The grass was trampled, and there were fresh footprints in the dirt, bare footprints. They were larger than mine and seemed to wander aimlessly around my campsite. My stomach dropped as I realized they hadn't been there the day before. I looked around, trying to spot anything out of place, but everything seemed normal. Maybe it was a local, I thought, though the idea didn't make me feel any better. Who walks barefoot through the woods in the middle of the night? I decided to leave the area and find a new spot. I told myself it was just some harmless wanderer, but a part of me couldn't shake the fear that someone had been watching me while I slept. By late afternoon, I found another clearing deeper in the forest. This one was more open, with a clear view of the sky. I set up my tent again, made a small fire, and tried to push the morning's discovery out of my mind. As the sun set, the forest seemed to close in around me. The shadows grew longer, and the sounds of the woods became sharper. I tried to focus on the stars above, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, I heard the rustling again. This time it was closer, circling my camp. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and knife. I didn't bother looking through the tent flap this time. I burst out, shining the light around. That's when I saw him. A man standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. He was tall and thin, with unkempt hair and no shoes. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he stood perfectly still, staring at me. My blood turned cold. I shouted at him to go away, but he didn't move. He just stood there, watching. My flashlight shook in my hand as I tried to keep the beam on him. Then, without a sound, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the fire, clutching my knife and flashlight, jumping at every sound. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to get out of the forest and back to the village. I packed up quickly and started hiking back toward the trail. The woods felt darker than before, and every crack of a branch made me flinch. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him following me. When I finally reached the village, I felt a wave of relief. But as I passed by a small cafe, something caught my eye. A faded missing poster taped to the window. The man in the photo looked eerily similar to the one I'd seen in the woods. The poster was dated 5 years earlier. I left San Pietro that day and never went back. To this day, I don't know if the man I saw was the same one from the poster or if he was even alive. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I feel that same unsettling presence, and I wonder if he ever left those woods, or if he followed me. The night had already fallen heavy when I pulled into the clearing. The rain wasn't letting up, a steady drumming against my truck. A sound so constant it almost seemed unreal. It was that kind of night, dark, cold, wet. The forest surrounding me felt endless, a sprawling sea of shadows. I was 35, used to this job, used to the outdoors and the cold. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was just the isolation, but I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. I worked as a woodcutter during the day, cutting down trees to be sold for furniture or firewood. Tonight was supposed to be a quick job. I'd already set up my camping gear in the small clearing on the edge of the woods, a place I'd used many times before. The tent was up, the tarp stretched tightly over it to shield me from the rain. I had a campfire going, though it was a struggle against the wet wood. As the fire crackled, I tried to focus on the task ahead, cutting down the trees near the camp, clearing the area for future logging. I'd done it 100 times before, but tonight felt different. I had a sharp sense that something wasn't right, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the steady, relentless rain. Maybe it was the eerie silence between downpours, the kind of silence that leaves a gnawing feeling in your stomach. The first tree I took down was easy enough. The rain made the ground slick, and the chainsaw roared to life, cutting through the wet bark and branches. But as I worked, I noticed something strange. The woods were too quiet. There were no animals, no birds, no squirrels, not even the occasional rustle of a deer. The wind had picked up, but it didn't seem natural. It was more like the wind was waiting, watching. I paused, wiped my brow, and glanced around. The trees stood still, shrouded in mist, as though they were holding their breath. I shook it off. Just the rain, I muttered to myself. I wasn't gonna let my mind wander. As the night stretched on, the woods seemed to close in around me. The trees, tall and thick, created a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. Even with the fire going, there was an unnatural darkness to the place. I could barely make out the edges of my camp in the shadowy gloom. Every time I glanced toward the woods, I thought I saw movement, something large darting between the trees. Could have been an animal, but I couldn't be sure. The shapes were too quick, the shadows too deep. I tightened my grip on the chainsaw. At around midnight, I decided to take a break. The rain was picking up again, falling in sheets now. I huddled inside my tent for warmth, listening to the sound of the downpour. The fire outside still crackled weakly, but it wasn't enough to banish the cold. I had a thermos of coffee with me, so I poured myself a hot cup, trying to steady my nerves, but it was no use. My mind kept going back to those shadows in the woods. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it lingered. It was like I was no longer alone out there. I tried to focus on the job at hand, but I couldn't. I had to go back out there, I told myself. Get the work done and leave. It was just a feeling, nothing more. I pulled on my rain jacket and grabbed the chainsaw again. The fire outside had died down to nothing but a few embers. It seemed like the night had swallowed it whole. As I stepped outside the tent, I froze. The air was different now, heavier. The rain fell in thick sheets, drenching me instantly. I wiped my face, adjusting my rain gear. There was no use in trying to stay dry now. I started walking toward the next tree to fell. But as I moved, I heard something in the distance, a low rumble. It wasn't thunder, though. It was a sound that was far too close, like something moving through the woods, A steady thump, thump, thump. My heart began to race. I stopped in my tracks, trying to locate the sound. It wasn't an animal. Too heavy. I couldn't tell what it was, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The feeling of being watched intensified. I turned slowly, the rain hammering my hood. There was something out there. I couldn't see it, but I felt it moving in the trees, watching me. With my hands shaking, I pulled the chansaw's cord. It roared to life, the noise cutting through the heavy silence of the woods. I walked toward the next tree, my footsteps muffled by the rain-soaked ground. That's when I heard it again, closer this time, the thumping. I turned my head quickly. There, in the dim light of the campfire, I thought I saw a shadow, a large figure, barely visible, crouching behind a tree. It moved, but it was too quick, vanishing into the dark. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. I backed toward the fire, trying to keep my focus. The chainsaw trembled in my grip. My mind raced. Should I call someone? No, there was no signal out here. I was alone, completely alone. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl from somewhere behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The woods stood still, the rain falling harder now. The growl hadn't been from an animal. It was too human, too deliberate. I was trapped. I bolted back toward my tent, adrenaline flooding my veins. I could hear something, heavy breathing, footsteps, and that low growl again, closer now. I could feel it right on my heels. I stumbled through the rain, slipping on the wet ground, but I didn't care. My focus was only on getting back to the tent, to the safety of whatever I could find inside. But as I reached the clearing where I had set up camp, I froze. The campfire was out. My tent, the place I had thought would protect me, was completely gone. The wind had ripped through it, and now it lay in tatters, the remnants of my gear scattered across the wet ground. And standing at the center of the clearing was a figure, tall and broad, almost human, but something was wrong. It stood motionless, drenched by the rain, its face hidden by the darkness. The growling stopped. I had no choice but to run. I didn't look back. My legs burned as I pushed forward, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. My heart was pounding in my ears. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. I found the road eventually, after what felt like an eternity. The truck was parked up ahead, lights off, the engine still running. I reached the door and slammed it shut, locking it as quickly as I could. I glanced out the window, expecting to see the figure in the woods, but there was nothing. The trees stood still, silent, as though nothing had ever happened. I didn't stay there long. I hit the gas, leaving the clearing and the woods behind. I didn't stop until I was miles away, but the feeling never left, that something was still out there, that it had been watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I've never gone back to those woods, and I never will. Some nights I still hear the growl, the sound of something following me, something waiting for the right moment to strike. And I know deep down I was lucky that night, lucky I made it out, because something in those woods wanted me, and it might still be out there. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a team-building trip. Just me, some colleagues from the bank, and our general manager, Mr. Thompson. We were heading to Pinewood Forest, a remote campground nestled in the hills. Nothing too fancy, just a place to unwind, set up tents, and cook over a fire. A couple of days to escape the usual grind. We left early, hoping to get there before dark. I was in my mid-30s at the time and had been working at the bank for almost a decade. I knew most of the team well, and we all got along pretty well. Even Mr. Thompson, who usually kept to himself, seemed in a good mood. I figured he could use this trip as much as anyone else. He had been running the bank for years, always stressed, always busy. The drive was long, and as we neared the forest, the roads got narrower. There were trees on either side, their tall trunks reaching high above, blocking out most of the sun. It was as if we were entering a different world. The air was fresh, tinged with the scent of pine and earth. Everything felt calm, almost too calm. We had rented a couple of large tents, enough for everyone. The plan was to set up camp, then maybe go on a short hike or just relax by the fire. By the time we arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest. The campsite was quiet, the only sounds coming from the wind rustling the leaves above. We unloaded the cars, chatting about how nice it would be to disconnect for a while. But something felt off. The place was too still, too quiet. I helped set up the tents, working alongside Rachel and Steve, two colleagues I'd known for a few years. Rachel, in her early 30s, was always upbeat and talkative, while Steve, a few years older, preferred to stay in the background, observing everything with a kind of quiet intensity. Mr. Thompson stayed off to the side, organizing the gear we'd brought for cooking and lighting the campfire. As the fire started, the warmth began to cut through the chill of the evening. The sound of crackling wood was a comfort, and for a while, everything felt normal again. We sat around the fire, eating simple meals and talking about work, the past year, and our plans for the future. It wasn't groundbreaking conversation, but it felt good to just be in the moment. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. A distant owl hooted, and the occasional rustle of animals moving through the underbrush could be heard. The stars were bright in the clear sky, almost too bright. Everything felt more isolated than usual, but we were all relaxed. But then, around midnight, things started to change. I had just finished the last of my food when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the forest behind us. I froze, straining to hear. There was no wind, nothing to explain the sound of branches cracking underfoot. I glanced around, but no one seemed to notice. Everyone else was either looking at their phones or staring into the fire. Could have been an animal, I told myself, but something didn't feel right. The footsteps continued, and I began to feel a growing sense of unease. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest playing tricks on me. But that thought didn't settle the tight knot in my stomach. A few minutes later, Steve noticed it too. He looked over at me, his face pale. I gave him a small nod, and he got up quietly, walking toward the edge of the camp, near the trees. He stood still for a while, as if waiting for something. I didn't move. Something in my gut told me it was best to stay put. When Steve returned, his expression was unreadable. "I think we're being watched," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. I didn't reply, couldn't. I felt it too. The unsettling sensation that something or someone was out there in the dark, hidden just beyond the trees. The feeling stuck with me, and I found it harder and harder to ignore. We tried to push the thought out of our heads and continued with the evening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see movement in the trees, but there was nothing. By the time the fire had burned low, everyone else seemed ready to call it a night. Mr. Thompson, who had been unusually quiet, stood up and stretched. "We'll be fine," he said, trying to reassure everyone, though his voice lacked conviction. I wasn't so sure. That night I barely slept. The sounds of the forest seemed louder, more intrusive. Every crack of a twig, every gust of wind, made my heart race. At one point, I even heard someone moving around outside the tent, and my breath caught in my throat. But when I peeked outside, no one was there, just the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. Morning came slowly, and the sun barely pierced the thick canopy above. Everyone was groggy, but no one seemed willing to admit they'd had a rough night. We gathered around the campfire, making coffee and trying to shake off the tension. But then Steve pointed something out. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "There's something missing," he said. "My bag. It was right next to the tent, and now it's gone." We all went quiet. There were no signs of animals, no scratches, no paw prints, nothing. It was as if the bag had just vanished. "I'll go look for it," Mr. Thompson said, his tone sharper than usual. He grabbed a flashlight and started walking toward the forest, his silhouette barely visible in the morning mist. We waited in silence. As the minutes passed, it became clear that something was off. Mr. Thompson had been gone too long. I stood up. "I'll go check on him." Rachel looked at me nervously but didn't say anything. I walked toward the trees, trying to stay calm, but my heart was pounding. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my footsteps crunching on the damp earth. And then I found it, a small clearing. In the middle of it, Mr. Thompson's flashlight was lying on the ground, still on, but no sign of him. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and scanned the area. That's when I noticed something else, footprints. Large, deep imprints in the soft ground. They weren't animal tracks. They looked like they belonged to a person. I followed them, my mind racing, and after a few minutes, I came to a sudden stop. There, hidden in the underbrush, was Mr. Thompson's body. His eyes were wide open, his mouth frozen in an expression of terror. His arms were twisted unnaturally behind him, and his clothes were torn. The world spun. My legs went weak and I nearly collapsed. But there was no time for that. I had to get back to the others. When I returned to camp, I could barely get the words out. Rachel and Steve rushed to me, their faces pale with fear. But I couldn't speak. I couldn't process it. I just pointed toward the forest. Steve immediately grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. We were alone, and whoever or whatever had done this was still out there. The rest of the day passed in a blur. We packed up quickly, not daring to stay another night. The sense of being watched never left us, and every shadow in the trees seemed like it was waiting to pounce. We made it out of Pinewood Forest by nightfall. As we drove away, the tension that had been building over the past 24 hours slowly started to ebb. But the memory of Mr. Thompson's lifeless body, his terrified eyes, stayed with me. The forest had been a quiet, peaceful place when we first arrived, but by the time we left, it felt like something had been waiting for us all along. Something that was no longer content to stay hidden. I had been planning the camping trip for months. A small, quiet village near the US-Mexico border, tucked away in the rugged hills of southern Arizona, was the perfect place to escape the noise of the city. The weather was warm, the nights cool, and the surroundings were as peaceful as you could get. It wasn't just the scenery that drew me in, though. It was the promise of solitude, the kind of isolation you could only find in places that felt forgotten by time. I wasn't one for crowds, and I liked camping alone. The peacefulness was a balm for the overstimulation of daily life. But the more I read about the area, the more I found myself intrigued by the local graveyard. It was small, hidden behind an old church on the outskirts of the village. The locals didn't talk much about it, and there were barely any markers on the graves. Only crude wooden crosses and worn stones, many of which had faded to the point of being unreadable. There was something haunting about the place, something that tugged at me the closer I got to it in my research. I wasn't superstitious, though. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, and I thought the whole idea of haunted places was just something to make people nervous. But curiosity got the better of me. The quiet beauty of the graveyard, combined with the eeriness of its surroundings, had a strange pull on me. I decided that during my trip, I would visit the graveyard. I arrived at the village late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The landscape was vast, stretching out for miles in all directions, with the only sign of civilization being the few weathered buildings scattered around. A small church stood at the village's edge, its bell tower looming against the fading sky. I checked into a local inn that seemed almost as old as the church, its creaky wooden floors and musty smell adding to the sense of stepping back in time. That night, after setting up my tent at a nearby campsite, I sat outside by a small fire, watching the stars overhead. It was as quiet as I had imagined. Nothing but the distant sound of coyotes and the occasional rustling of leaves. Felt peaceful, but there was an underlying stillness, a heaviness in the air that didn't quite sit right with me. The silence, though calming, was almost too perfect. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, even though I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The thoughts of the graveyard crept in, and I felt an odd urge to go there. So, despite the chill creeping into the evening air, I packed a small bag with water and snacks, grabbed my flashlight, and headed toward the church. The walk through the village was uneventful. The streets were empty, the houses all dark, their windows like hollow eyes staring into nothing. I couldn't help but notice the sense of abandonment. It was a place frozen in time, and I felt it with every step. When I reached the church, the graveyard was just behind it, tucked into the shadows. The ground was uneven, with tall, scraggly grass poking out between the graves. Most of the crosses were barely standing, crooked from years of neglect. A few had fallen over completely. Their once white would now faded and gray, blending with the dust. The air felt thicker here, heavier. I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but there was something about the graveyard that didn't sit well with me. I walked deeper into the yard, scanning the area with my flashlight. The beam flickered over the graves, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally far. It was as though the darkness here didn't behave like normal darkness. The whole place felt off. The wind had picked up, and I heard the creaking of the old trees that surrounded the graveyard, their branches swaying gently. But it wasn't the wind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was a sound, a soft, distant thud, like the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening intently. There was nothing else, just the wind and the creaking of the trees. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer or a small mammal knocking over some rocks. But as I stood there in the dark, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a figure standing at the far end of the graveyard. I was sure I hadn't seen anyone else walking in. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area, but the figure remained. It was tall and thin, draped in what looked like tattered clothing, its shape barely visible in the dim light. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then it moved. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. There was no mistaking it now. The figure was real. It had moved closer, its pace slow and deliberate. My flashlight flickered as I swung it around to shine on the figure, but it didn't seem to reach. The shadows felt like they were swallowing the light. A surge of panic hit me, and I turned to run. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs felt weak. I had to get out of there, but as I turned, I tripped on a stone and fell hard, the rough ground scraping my palms. The thud echoed in the still night. My flashlight flew from my hand and landed a few feet away, its beam pointing straight toward the figure. It was closer now, standing at the edge of the light. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me, waiting for me to move. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain in my hands and knees. I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. I ran as fast as I could, my breath ragged, my feet pounding the ground. The sound of my own footsteps drowned out everything else, but in the back of my mind, I was sure I could hear something else, something following me. It wasn't the sound of footsteps, but something else, like the soft rustling of fabric, the sound of something moving in the shadows. I didn't stop running until I was back at my campsite, my heart still racing in my chest. My flashlight had gone out, and the only light I had now came from the fading embers of my campfire. I collapsed beside it, gasping for breath, my mind spinning. I didn't know what I had seen in that graveyard, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. The rest of the night was a blur. I didn't sleep. Every sound, every movement in the distance made my heart race, and I kept my eyes glued to the edges of the campsite. The hours dragged on, and eventually, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The fear that had gripped me started to ebb, but I knew I would never be able to shake the memory of what I had felt out there. I packed up my things early the next morning, leaving the campsite behind. I didn't say goodbye to anyone in the village. I just left. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had encountered wasn't finished, that it had followed me out of the graveyard and into my life. As I drove away, the village disappearing behind me, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a split second, I thought I saw someone standing by the side of the road, watching me leave. The figure was thin and tall, just like the one in the graveyard. I didn't stop to find out. It was late September, and the air was crisp, carrying a cool bite that made me pull my jacket tighter around my body as I drove down the winding dirt road. I'd been planning this camping trip for weeks, trying to get away from the noise of city life, the constant buzz of work, and everything that felt suffocating. I was in my mid-30s, single, and had always enjoyed spending time outdoors, alone just the way I liked it. I had booked a campsite deep in the woods, an area known for its rugged beauty and isolation. I didn't mind the solitude. I actually sought it out. The more remote, the better. No one would be around for miles, and that was perfect. I'd packed my gear the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, food for the weekend, a small stove, and enough water to last me the few days I planned to stay. Nothing fancy, just the essentials. I arrived around midday, the sun still high in the sky, the woods darkening the further I drove. The campsite was at the end of a narrow trail, and I parked my truck as close to the site as I could. I'd have to carry everything in, but it wasn't too far, just a few hundred yards. It didn't bother me. The moment I stepped out of the truck, I could hear the wind moving through the trees, a soft, almost calming sound. I unloaded my gear and started walking to the campsite. The trees were thick here, and the trail was only lightly marked. I had to pay attention to my steps, not wanting to trip over a root or something hidden in the undergrowth. After a short walk, I reached the clearing, a small patch of land surrounded by tall pines. I set up my tent by the edge of the trees, just far enough to get a good view of the forest, but not so close that I'd feel cramped. The sun was slipping lower in the sky now, casting long shadows over the ground. I quickly got a fire going, not because it was cold, yet, but because I liked the comforting crackle of the flames, the orange glow lighting up the clearing. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped noticeably, and I was glad I had packed warm clothes. As the fire crackled, I cooked a simple meal, the smell of food mingling with the pine and earth. Felt good, peaceful. I sat by the fire, eating and listening to the sounds of the night. The rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance, a light breeze that whispered through the trees. It was exactly what I needed. My mind, which had been constantly occupied by work and stress, felt clear for the first time in months. But then, around midnight, I heard something that didn't belong. It was a noise, soft at first, like something large moving through the brush. At first, I dismissed it. Animals, no doubt. Maybe a deer or a bear. It wasn't uncommon to hear wildlife in these parts, especially at night. But this was different. This sound was too deliberate, like something large walking on two legs. I froze, listening closely. The sound was moving closer, though slowly, as if it was trying not to make noise. My heart rate picked up. I told myself it was just an animal, but my gut didn't buy it. There was something about the way it was moving, careful, almost methodical, that didn't feel right. I sat perfectly still, straining my ears, trying to hear anything else, anything to make sense of it. But there was nothing. No wind, no other animals. Just silence, except for the soft rustling from the trees. I kept my eyes fixed on the edge of the camp, where the forest began to thicken again. I didn't have a weapon, just a small knife for cooking and a flashlight, but I wasn't about to let whatever was sneak up on me. I reached for the flashlight, my hand trembling slightly as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, scanning the trees, the bushes, the shadows. Nothing. I exhaled sharply, relieved for a moment. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. I let out a shaky laugh to calm myself. It wasn't the first time my mind had played tricks on me in the dark. But then the sound came again, closer now. I turned the flashlight toward the noise. The beam illuminated the edge of the woods, but nothing moved. The shadows felt wrong, as if something was hiding just out of sight, waiting. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching me. I didn't want to leave the fire. Fire was safety. But there was something deeply unsettling about the silence surrounding me now. The absence of any other sounds. The absence of the usual nighttime rustles of the forest. Suddenly, there was a snap, like a twig breaking, and I whirled around, my heart hammering in my chest. A figure, tall, thin, almost unnaturally so, stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was human-shaped, but something was off. The way it stood, too still, too rigid. It didn't move. It just watched. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to shout, to demand whatever it was to leave, but the words died in my throat. The figure made no sound, no movement. It didn't seem like it was there to hurt me. It was just watching, waiting. I grabbed my knife, the only thing I had to defend myself, and stood up, slowly. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like stone. Every part of me screamed to just leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure standing just outside the firelight. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure stepped back into the darkness of the trees. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I waited, staring into the forest, but it didn't reappear. The night was still again. I stayed up the rest of the night, refusing to sleep. I kept my flashlight on, scanning the woods every few minutes, but no more figures appeared. By dawn, I was exhausted, drained from the tension, but I refused to leave. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe it had been a person out hiking, but that didn't explain the way it stood, the way it hadn't moved when I turned on the light. The next day, I packed up and left early. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't explain, but I didn't want to stay another night. As I drove away, the woods seemed to close in around me, and I couldn't help but glance back. There was no sign of anything unusual, no figure lurking in the trees, but the sense of being watched stayed with me long after I left the forest behind. It wasn't until a week later, when I was back home, that I learned something disturbing. That exact spot, the campsite I had chosen, had been the site of an unsolved disappearance, a case from years ago. A hiker, alone, had vanished without a trace in the same area I'd camped, and no one had ever found out what happened to him. I don't know what I saw that night in the woods. Maybe it was a person, or maybe it was something else. But what I do know is that I wasn't alone. Something was out there, something that didn't want me to stay, and I'll never go back to those woods again. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the Ozarks. I needed a break, and after a few months of work, I wanted something quiet, away from the distractions of daily life. I wasn't prepared for what I was about to face. I had never been to the Ozarks before, but I'd heard good things about the area. My map said there were some great trails up there, with plenty of secluded spots to camp. I figured I'd do a couple of nights, enjoy some quiet, and clear my mind. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Something about the idea of being completely alone in the woods appealed to me. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, and a couple of books to pass the time. The hike to the campsite was about 6 miles, so I figured I'd get a good workout in before setting up. The sun was just starting to set as I made my way through the forest, the air crisp with the early signs of autumn. The scent of pine filled my nose, and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot was oddly comforting. I reached the site just as twilight began to set in. It was a small clearing, surrounded by trees, with a stream running nearby. Perfect, I thought. I set up camp quickly and started a fire. The flames crackled as I warmed up a can of beans and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming the peace was just part of the isolation. But as the night went on, I began to notice the stillness a little more. There were no owls, no rustling animals in the underbrush, nothing. It was just silent. After finishing my meal, I grabbed my flashlight and wandered around the perimeter of the camp. The forest looked almost too perfect. The trees stood straight, their branches untouched by wind, and the night sky above was clear, full of stars. It was beautiful, but something felt off. I brushed it off, thinking I was just tired from the hike. As I settled into my tent later that night, I heard a noise. It wasn't loud, just a slight rustling in the underbrush, but it was enough to make me freeze. I lay still, listening. It stopped. I waited a little longer, then shook it off. I was overthinking things, but then I heard it again. This time it was closer. I could hear twigs snapping underfoot, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, shining it toward the noise. There was nothing, just trees and shadows. I laid back down, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But there was something about the way the rustling stopped when I shined the light that unsettled me. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Sleep didn't come easily, and when I did manage to drift off, it was fitful. Morning came and I was relieved. I packed up camp quickly, eager to get moving, but as I was getting ready to leave, I noticed something strange. The ground near the edge of the camp was disturbed, like someone had been walking around it. The tracks were odd. They weren't animal prints. They were too big, too deliberate, and they seemed to circle the camp. My heart started racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I gathered my things in a hurry and started the hike back to the trailhead, but the unease lingered. As I walked, the woods seemed to close in on me. The trees grew thicker, and the path twisted and turned in ways I didn't remember. The trail was supposed to be a straight shot back to my truck, but I kept finding myself off course. I looked at my map, but something was wrong. I didn't recognize any of the landmarks. I had been following the trail markers, but it felt like the woods were shifting, like I was being led somewhere I didn't want to go. Panic started to set in, and I quickened my pace. My breaths came faster, and I started to look over my shoulder every few minutes. but the woods were empty. The further I went, the more disoriented I became. I checked my map again and realized that I had been hiking for hours longer than I should have. I was lost. I stopped for a moment to get my bearings. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail. I heard the faint rustling again, but this time, it wasn't just one noise. It was multiple circling me. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the quiet of the forest. I pulled out my phone to check for service, but there was nothing. No bars, no GPS signal, just dead air. I turned off my phone to save the battery, feeling more and more isolated with each passing minute. I decided to keep moving, hoping to stumble across something familiar. The rustling followed me, always just beyond my line of sight. It was like the woods were alive, watching, waiting. I could hear the sound of footsteps now, too slow, deliberate. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to listen. Then it hit me. I wasn't alone. There was someone else out here. I broke into a run. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stand the thought of standing still, waiting to be caught. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs burned from the effort. I heard the rustling growing louder, closer. I rounded a bend in the trail, and suddenly, I was in a small clearing. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, but I could make out the outline of its body. It was too still, too quiet. I froze, my body locking up in terror. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see its face. And then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I sprinted in the opposite direction, not looking back. The trees blurred as I ran, but I couldn't escape the feeling of being hunted. My mind was racing, wondering if I was just imagining things, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. Someone was out there, and they were following me. Hours passed as I kept moving, desperately searching for any sign of the trailhead. My feet were sore, my body exhausted, but I couldn't stop, not until I knew I was safe. Just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it, the familiar sight of a trail marker. I had made it back to the main path. I was so relieved, I almost cried. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, and when I finally climbed into the driver's seat, I locked the doors and sat there, breathing heavily. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but the road behind was empty. It wasn't until I was driving away, headed back home, that I felt safe. But the thought of that figure standing still and watching me stayed with me. Even now, when I think back on it, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't just lost in the woods that day. I was being led there on purpose, and I was lucky to escape. The thing that still haunts me the most is the silence. The way the forest felt dead quiet, like it was waiting for something. And then, when I was at my most vulnerable, it showed me that there are things in the woods that we are better off not understanding. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again.